Hi, thank you all for joining us here at the Tribune. I obviously drew the short straw to follow Pastor Evan. And I know a lot of you are here and interested in events, so I just wanted to poll the room and find out how many of you are producing events right now. So that's like a good percentage of you are. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
It's also our 10th anniversary for Vermont Digger,
Mm-hmm.
and we just produced a series of events. One was a thank you event for our highest donors.
Yeah, sorry. There's a microphone.
Yep. Thanks, Rodney.
Sorry, I just put in.
Sorry, how impolite.
Hello, I'm Liz Raddock. I'm the Director of Special Projects at Vermont Digger. And we're just we're just in our 10th year anniversary right now, so we're doing a series of events. First one was for our donors to thank them. Mm-hmm. Second one was in another part of the state as a public forum with David Sanger from the New York Times. And the last one we just had was we had 300 people that had agreed to come to celebrate our 10th anniversary, our members. So
membership, donor loyalty, and the celebration, mm-hmm. or the editorial event,
yes.
with the New York Times.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else want to tell us about events that you're working on? Here. Okay. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Anne from The Lens in New Orleans. We host an open records workshop, maybe 2 to 4 times a year, depending on funding and time. And it's an editorial event where the first half of the hour and a half is dedicated to 101. This is how you access open records. This is what you do. There's a slide presentation. There's a link where people can access it later. And then the second half is driven by the education reporter or our land use reporter, and they will address questions one-on-one, or audience questions specific to schools, education reporting, whatever the topic may be for that.
Are those reporter-led conversations?
Yes, so reporter and editor are both at the table, and sometimes our lawyer who helps us with open records and our fake subpoena mm-hmm. reporting and things will participate.
Do you have any like video or anything that you publish out of those events after the fact?
PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
And that's accessible to anyone
who wants to, okay, yeah. And maybe one more. Let's get a little sampling of, there were some hands over here. Nobody wants to tell us what they're up to? Go ahead.
Hey, my name's Clayton Alder, and I'm with an environmental magazine called Grist. And we do a whole bunch of public-facing events, both in person and digitally. So an example of the latter would be a quote-unquote virtual town hall that we might host in conjunction with a group like the People's Climate Movement, mm-hmm. In which case we'll facilitate a conversation with members of the audience around a given question of interest. That'll run for maybe like an hour online. Uh-huh. In-person events are kind of all over the place for us. So it'll be any, on the civic engagement front, we may have an editor host a debate between members or candidates running for city council, mm-hmm. right? So this actually, that is something happening tomorrow. There are some candidates for Seattle City Council who are going to be participating in a debate on the environment. We're kind of co-producing this event with the local radio station, and our CEO will be the moderator of the debate.
Awesome.
Member-facing events,
mm-hmm.
donor-facing events.
And mostly editorial in terms of the content.
Yeah, I think the other thing to add is that there's this arm of Grist that thinks a bit more about quote-unquote solutions journalism, mm-hmm. and in particular about it sees itself as a bit of a solutions lab. Mm-hmm. And so the events that come out of this arm of Grist, which is called Fix, they're more along the lines of workshops, even like comedy events, but kind of bringing young leaders together.
Experimentation.
Right, for the purpose of mm-hmm. collaboration.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's more editorial events than usually when I poll audiences like you guys about the kinds of events that they're doing. I hear a lot about, membership, donor loyalty. There's, things that are run out of the marketing department, bridal shows, awards luncheons, those kinds of things to earn revenue around events. And those are tried and true, and they work. The local media association has done several workshops around those kinds of strategies, and so there's a lot of information out there about those kinds of events. The Tribune doesn't do those kinds of events, and so I just kind of want to start off by saying that there's a lot of different ways that you can use events to leverage all of the different things that are important to your organization, from audience building to fundraising, et cetera. We've really honed in on this idea of the editorial event. And so I just want it to be clear that, we're talking about kind of a sliver of the way that you can do things, right? And so I'll give you the information, the secret sauce, if you will, about what we do, but with the understanding that there's lots of other ways that you can approach this for your organization. So as Evan talked about, he started this organization with a background in being a public personality. He had a TV show on PBS, which is then called Texas Monthly Talks, now called Overheard with Evan Smith. I met him when I worked at the Austin Film Society. He had co-founded an event that we did to fundraise called the Texas Film Awards, where we honored famous Texans in the movie business. He was instrumental in helping to get the talent to agree to come to that event and sponsorship. So he has a long track record of events before he founded the Tribune, and he was a known personality out in the community. I came on board in 2012 with the Texas Tribune. They had been doing events for a couple of years, and I would say at that point, nobody knew who the state legislators were. Like, those names don't mean anything, but Evan Smith, yes, I will show up to hear Evan Smith talk to somebody. I don't know who he's talking to, but I'll go. So that was kind of the initial motivation in those early events. He will say that it was people coming to hear from their state legislators, and I think that was part of it. But I think a lot of it was him driving it as well. And his idea from the beginning was that if we're going to do the event, if we're going to have this conversation, that's journalism. The interview with these people is journalism. And I would say, just kind of there's lots of stars and asterisks next to things that I'll say that we've learned along the way. We record things, like how do you distribute it afterward is certainly a big part of the conversation as far as events. They're expensive to produce. It's journalism. You want people to access that content later. So figuring out the strategy around how the event strategy and the content that's generated fits into your overall publication is really important. But ultimately, it's all about the program. What are you talking about? You talk about certain events that you're doing, and you're kind of building audiences around editorial events already, and that is awesome because, like I said, a lot of organizations that I talk to really feel unsure and on shaky ground around having public policy conversation. Like, is this something that people actually want to go to? Like, how do we get them out into to giving up their valuable time to coming to something that we are presenting? And then, obviously, how do we make money off that? But I would say, Evan mentioned, like, you got to have the product. So what is the conversation? We were super lucky to have Evan. Even if you didn't know who the state legislators were, you might have known who Evan was. You know that he's a good interviewer, and he doesn't disappoint when they're on site, right? I've been looking at 7 years worth of audience evaluations of our events. Evan, we love Evan. He's an awesome interviewer. whatever other things, that has been very consistent over time. So, when people talk about how do I get started on this, well, who do you have in your sphere that is maybe a known entity in that way? Are they a star reporter that leads online conversations that could then translate into a live in-person event? We only cover politics and public policy, but I know other organizations, for example, may take their food writer and have them lead a farm-to-table dinner. Things like that where you're leveraging their expertise and their celebrity within your community to build the event around what they have to offer and the audience that will bring to the table. In terms of the sponsorship, a lot of times this is also aligning to the content. I know April is not actually with us today, but I assume that in the little talk that you're going to watch, she'll talk about aligning their interest with the event content. We'll do a conversation on public education, and she knows, these 10 organizations are really interested in public education, so that event is coming up. I'm gonna go and talk to them about it. Sometimes if they can't be there for the event, they don't wanna sponsor it because they actually care about the content. They wanna be there and be present, not just have their money or their brand on it, although that's part of it. They really care about the issues. So understanding, what the topics are and how that aligns with sponsorship interest is a really big part of what we do. Rodney referenced the number of events that we do. Somewhere between 50 and 60. About half of those are actually right here in this room. We do what we call conversation series here in Austin, and it's about 25 to 30 events, depending on the legislative session. We have our legislature meets every other year, so those years when we have leg in session, we do a lot more of the conversations. But they tend to range. We'll have series sponsors that just pay to be a part of every single of those 20, 25 events. But then we'll have, like I said, a public education conversation coming up with the chairman of the House committee. Okay, let me go and add those on. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But understanding where that alignment is with the program that you're offering and how others might have an interest there is a big part of our success. These are just some graphics from different kinds of events. I thought you might like to see a little bit kind of inside an event. This one down on the bottom is Wendy Davis here in this room. She's running for office. So Evan had a conversation with her. We turned this screen into a backdrop. You see we have cameras all around the room. We live stream these conversations. And that's actually, it's kind of a small room. So we get, maybe 75 to 80 people in here in person, and then we can have up to 500-600 watching online if they're particularly newsworthy. And then that content flips over, that video after the live stream gets flipped over onto our website, so folks who didn't watch it in real time can go back and watch it. If they make news, we'll do clips from it, that kind of thing. The one up in the corner there is a traveling event. So you can see we try to have a little bit of brand consistency across the events. When we travel, we want it to look like a Texas Tribune event. And I threw up this one, the Cine El Rey, because that was actually a member event that we did down in the Valley. We did a film about, our investigative reporter Jay Root did a film about the migrants coming up from Central America and what that story was. And we decided to show that in different communities as member events. So we rented out the theater, we invited our members, and actually we didn't have a huge member presence in that town, so it was also a cultivation event. If you came to, we did a legislative conversation earlier in the day, and then we invited everybody to come in the evening for a different kind of event and experience with us. So here's the nitty-gritty that you want to know. Keep the production costs low. Events are a high dollar business if you let it get away from you. one of the big cost savings that we hit on was partnering with colleges and universities to host our events. So the room rental, I mean, if anybody has ever done events where you're renting out a venue, that can be like a third, maybe even half of the budget of what you're spending to produce that event. Well, finding some community or organization that has a space that's aligned with the content and that is willing to donate it, not only do you get the venue potentially, in kind, but you're also getting probably access to their audience. So when we are on a college campus, we ask them to be a host sponsor, and I'll show you what that looks like. And ask them to also invite their community. We'll save your VIPs a seat at the event. You're hosting this conversation with state legislators on campus. Sometimes, Evan mentioned Sol Ross. They had brought the legislators who were going to be at our event out early and had university official meetings with them throughout the morning in advance of our lunchtime conversation. So they really leveraged that opportunity of those state legislators coming to campus for their own purposes, which is exactly what makes that valuable to them, having our event on campus. So we, by and large, I would say in the 7 years that I've been doing this, I will cold call a university president's office and say, I'm calling from the Texas Tribune and I'd like to do an event on campus and I want you to cover the costs. And they say, sure. Very, very rarely have I not gotten a positive response to that. It goes back to them understanding what the product is. They're probably already reading us. They know who we are. If they're in higher education administration, that's one of our verticals that we cover. So there's, some track record there. They don't know me, but they know the Texas Tribune. And so they know that we're going to bring something interesting to campus. AV, if I had $1 for every time the microphones went out or some ridiculous technical problem, that's where I always recommend to invest your budget. A lot of times I'll, like I'm saying, they'll give us the room rental that'll include some kind of basic AV. If it doesn't seem like it's up to snuff, add some budget to help cover it, because there's nothing worse than people who have shown up to an event and can't hear. That's the Central Presbyterian during the Texas Tribune Festival, which just ended. Everybody, I couldn't hear at Central Presbyterian. It's terrible. You don't want people to have spent this money and this time, and it's deflating. But also, if you're going to post video and those kinds of things, you want it to be high quality, right? Nobody wants to sit and watch on their computer something that is barely visible or barely audible. So think about that production value, and I would suggest that that's where you invest your budget. Food is one of those things that can just totally get away from you. Evan mentioned that we provide lunch at those free events, and I still hammer myself over the head over all those times when I, added all those extra lunches and nobody showed up to eat them, and or conversely, we didn't order enough and a couple people didn't get lunch. But we also had the other experience. For instance, the morning conversation series that we did here in Austin, we used to do it at a nearby club before we had this space. There's a member supper club around the corner that a lot of the Politico types hang out at. So it was a really good spot for us to do a morning conversation with legislators. People were probably already in the area milling around. And it was a nice kind of pre-work stop to come in and get your coffee. And when they originally started that series, they were ordering pastries, coffee and pastries. And if you know anything about catering, you're paying by the person, right? So, okay, we guess that there's going to be 50 people there. We give them that as our catering count, and all these people show up and nobody eats the pastry. Well, that feels like a lot of wasted money, right? So we stopped ordering the pastry, and there was maybe one person who consistently, 5 years later was still asking, where's the pastry? But for the most part, nobody missed it. It didn't impact the audience. It didn't draw people, and it didn't keep them away. So do you need that? If it's a cultivation event or a stewardship event, yeah, they probably want to have a free drink, and they might want to have some appetizers with that. But if it's an editorial conversation and you situate it at the right time, maybe you don't need to worry so much about having all the provisions. And then printing, these are just kind of the basic line items. I know some of you are really looking for some nuts and bolts. And I remember when I started this job going madly on the internet, events budget template, like, what do I need to account for? These are the kind of big things. And obviously, as you think about what your purpose is for the event, the audience that you're trying to reach, you might wind up adding some different line items, but event production is not rocket science. It's being detail-oriented, it's pre-planning, doing the work ahead of time so that you're not scrambling on the day of to figure out how you're gonna do things. But ultimately, it's not that hard if you think it through. I know you're all totally capable of doing that. I talked a little bit before about the in-kind partnerships, the host sponsorship. What does that look like? This is an event that we have coming up. I pulled the sponsor lockup that's on the event. So if you go onto our website right now, texastribune.org/events, you can click on El Paso and the legislature, and it'll take you to the Eventbrite listing where we collect our SVPs, and you'll see this down at the end of the page. And it's a really good example because it has all of the different funding sources on it. For other events, you might have, a lot less than this. We have a presenting sponsor, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas, who's sponsored all of these events that we're doing. We're calling it a legislative city series, where we're visiting each of the big cities post legislative session to talk with the legislators about what happened during session. So they've been a big supporter of our traveling series year after year, so they get top billing on that. Las Palmas del Sol is a local presenting sponsor. The ones in the middle are basically supporting sponsors, so less money, but still important in the aggregate. And then we have El Paso Community College as our host sponsor for this event, and we have a media sponsor. So Evan talked about collaborating with our media partners. We give them a call and say, we're coming to the market. Can you guys help us get the word out about this event? In return, we'll add you as a media sponsor. We may wind up, helping them to get priority interviews with our panelists before or after the event. If it's a paper, sometimes they want to bring papers and put them out. That's awesome. We love to promote the local media. So whatever makes it valuable to them is what we're going to try to do. And then we have the foundation sponsors acknowledged as well. Those are the ones that kind of come through the development door, and usually they're either geographic-based or topical, and I think this one is geographic-based in this case. And then this is not the same event, but I wanted you to see this easel sign I put up, at least 2 at every event, one at the entrance and one next to the food, so people know who is paying for their food. And Evan will begin the event by listing off the sponsors, talking about how valuable that support is to us. So they get verbal recognition from the stage. They're on the listing. They're on the email invitations that go out. They are on the survey if we're surveying the audience after the fact. So they're attached to everything that winds up being produced related to that event. And some of these are cash sponsors, and some of them are in kind. Does anybody have any questions about the year-round program? Yeah, go ahead.
you're not asking the media sponsors to actually give cash. You're asking them to do some sort of in-kind, right?
For the most part. We do have, particularly around festivals, some of the bigger media organizations are coming in as paid sponsors, but usually when we're going into a local market like this, yes, we're not asking them to give us money.
Hi, this is less about sponsors and more about how do you, since it's a year-round program, I'm just kind of curious how you manage election years when, like next year is a big election year, when the lawmakers are up for re-election and you're kind of giving them a platform. How do you balance out the need to, like, I mean, this is a perennial probably journalism question, but it comes up for me in around events, in particular in an election year.
So I mentioned the series that we do here in Austin, 25 to 30 events. Those are open-ended topically at the point that we're planning and budgeting. So right now for next year, like we'll have a placeholder for them. We know about how much it's going to cost, and we know how many that we want to do, but the topics, who knows? In an election year, a lot of them wind up being candidate conversations, which our sponsorship director hates because a lot of businesses don't want to support partisan, the appearance of being partisan, right? They give to both or neither. So that winds up eating into her ability to fundraise. We don't actually do a lot of candidate forums, just as a rule, and on the occasions when we've done them, it's usually because our editorial department thinks that it's a hot race for whatever reason, and so we'll do it, but then we wind up getting, pushback from the audience, like, why didn't you do the other side, or why didn't you invite everyone? I mean, we do invite everyone, but if they don't show up, the audience just thinks we didn't invite them, right? So we tend to shy away from the full-on like debates and that kind of stuff. I think that it is a potential space for the Tribune if we wanted to grow in that direction, where you're really thinking about how to produce it in a way that you're getting everybody at the table and that kind of thing. But I would say that is going to wind up more on the editorial bucket and probably not going to wind up being super sponsorable. So what is your reason for doing it? Those are the kinds of decisions that are being made on our end.
What does a successful event look like? Because we do a few of these, they're at a journalism school, and, we have some journalism students show up, which is awesome. We love that. We don't really see a big uptick, though, in, our newsletter or members afterward. Like, how do you use it to grow your nonprofit?
I would put it back to you, and I would say you have to have some goals set out in advance of the decision to do it, right? Because in the field of events, you have tons of options. There's different ways that you can do it, different times of day where you'll reach different audiences. If your primary audience is to engage students, like they ain't showing up to our 7:30 events, right? And so we've actually done experimentation where we said, okay, like we know that this is not working, but we know that young people are interested in politics and public policy. What's something that we could do to specifically target that group? So we did a series, we called it the Summer Salon series, where one of our reporters who was particularly interested in engaging that group came up with some ideas for topical conversations that she thought would be interesting. She went after speakers who were in that age bracket, so not inviting like the committee chairman, but inviting like the thought leader who was like the level below and more the age of the target audience that we were looking at. And we did it over the happy hour at a restaurant. So you could come and get a drink and have some snacks and listen to the conversation. It was hugely successful in getting that target audience that we wanted. So it's absolutely possible to craft an event that will speak to the people that you want to engage, but you have to decide in advance. Like, we already know that this thing that we're doing is not going to work for students, but can we modify what we do to reach that target audience? Decide who it is. That's where like your whole team can be instrumental. I wasn't thinking about that. She was millennial herself, and that was kind of her idea for how we could engage people her age. So she came up with the idea, and we were able to support it using the things that we know about what works and what doesn't work for events. So, I think that there's always more that you can do to engage audiences. I would look at that particular example and say, I don't think we did a good job afterwards of having more for them. Whether it was a newsletter that they would have been interested in, coming to the festival as a student group. I mean, we did add them to our student list. And so when we send out stuff that's event related and we kind of think young people will be into it, we send it to them, but it's not as much of a fleshed out audience engagement pipeline that I think we could develop. We're limited, as I know you all are, to how many of these kind of separate conversations you can run concurrently, right? So those are organization decisions to say, this year we're gonna focus on these 3 core audiences, and we're gonna produce 3 events per cohort, and really target them and have ongoing products and services that are gonna speak to them. I would say that is what we're trying to get to when it comes to different audiences that we already have. We speak really well to insider political people, news followers. That's who a lot of those legislative conversations are for. When we travel, Evan talked about the people who come out to those events. We're promoting to the Chamber of Commerce, the school board, the city council, the political parties, people who have an interest in politics and public policy just because of their involvement with these organizations. So as a matter of routine, that's who we reach out to. And hey, we got a free event with state legislators, come on down. Sure, they'll help us promote it, no problem. And that's who we typically see flooding out to those events.
So exciting. I have so many questions.
I'm going to be here for lunch too, so we can dive more into it if you want.
Oh, good. Well, how do you decide what audiences you're going to go after, and then and then from there, how do you decide what events might appeal to them?
Right. I mean, I think that that the audiences is the team-wide thing, and if you look on our strategic plan, it lays out our core target audiences of growth. We're looking to increase our market share around different cities in Texas. We want to speak to young people. We want to speak to women. So those were high-level strategic decisions at the organization. And I would say, just Evan's charisma and the people who follow him. I mean, we just got a lock on the wonks. Right? He calls our festival Woodstock for Wonks for a reason, because the people who know him and know us, they know that they're going to get a really insightful political or public policy conversation there. Our challenge as a growing organization as well is to think about those new audiences, and you do have to test. I mean, there's just no way around experimenting when it comes to the events. We know what I'm telling you, that the young people don't show up to the morning events. When we're on campus, if it's extra credit, they're there. If it's not, they're too busy. Evan mentioned that Sol Ross event. It was amazing because in the lead up to it, we had nobody RSVP'd. It was like, 30 people. And I'm like, we're driving for 8 hours. We're like, nobody's gonna be there. And so we're kind of like shaking the chain of the people in the president's office, like, help us get out the word. Well, they must have told every professor on campus to bring their class, because we had planned for like 50 people. We had 150 people. And And I was like, I know students don't RSVP, but please tell us. That was one of the ones where we ran out of food, and all I could say was, I'm really glad that they're here, because we drove a long way and nobody cared that we ran out of food. I mean, it's only an hour and so nobody starved. It was great. And it was really wonderful to have all those students there.
Sounds like a good problem.
I'm curious, when you're planning your events, where you ideally start, because you need a sponsor, you need a venue, you need a program. Which ideally comes first, or do you always have one that comes first?
I started to mention the planning process. So, we're going to do 50 events next year. We know that 25 to 30 of those are going to be our Austin Conversation series. We had a couple of, I mentioned that Around the State series that Blue Cross Blue Shield has been funding. Those were 8. We would do 4 in the fall and 4 in the spring. And then we would do kind of one-day symposium style events. Basically, we had decided to do 4 a year. So we have this framework, right, of the formats and the quantity of the events that we wanted to do. We kind of know about how much that's going to cost. So this is how much we want to allocate this budget to. Here's the framework in which it's going to be. And then when we're traveling around, we were targeting different markets based on like how frequently had we been there? Were there interesting legislators that we haven't had a chance to talk to that we want to go out to their community and talk to them there? So those decisions about the where and the who are largely editorial driven. But we try to outline it at the beginning of the year, understanding like, okay, this is where we think we're going. That helps with budgeting. It helps think about what the topic is going to be as we get closer. And then in terms of the venues, okay, we've decided on these 8 cities. Let's talk about the different colleges and universities that are there. Then I would start reaching out, or if April, our chief revenue officer, has a relationship with any of the colleges and universities, we would reach out via those contacts to people that we already knew there to find out if they'd be hosting us. So then the conversation is about nailing down a date, right? So once you have the city and the venue and the date, then, it's pretty much, I need about, in an ideal world, I get the event posted like 30 days before it's happening so that we have plenty of time to promote it and, hit people a couple of times to get their RSVPs. Sometimes that doesn't always happen. 2-3 weeks is less ideal, but it still has worked for us in the past, depending on how active the partner is or how good our mailing list is in a particular region. So I would say, it could go either way, that it's geographically driven or topically driven. But we do set out a framework for what that's going to look like at the beginning of the year and budget accordingly. Well, the sponsors are either topical or geography as well. So like knowing, April will know, well, okay, you're gonna do a series on healthcare. I'm gonna hit up everybody that I have in my Rolodex that has an interest in healthcare. So she'll go, as soon as she has a description of what the event is going to be, she hits them up right away. And I'm sure she would love way more time, and Terry would love way more time than sometimes we have in order to get them on board with that kind of thing. But that's where their deep knowledge of the interests of the people who are supporting us comes in. And sometimes they jump in the boat, like, okay, that topic is really important to me, and I'm gonna reach out to the Tribune and find out how I can sponsor that. And then sometimes it's geographic based. So I know I use Amarillo National Bank as an example. They don't sponsor anything except everything that we do in Amarillo. And so there's a few of those that are just, if we're coming to town, they want to be part of it. So hopefully April will talk more about that in her video, because she's the one who actually does that. But I would say topic and geography are the top buckets that they fall into.
Hi, I'm Fraser Nelson from the Salt Lake Tribune. I just have a quick question. What kind of data do you collect about the people that are there? Do you get their names and email, zip code? Like what
We at the registration point on Eventbrite, we take their name, email, and zip code, absolutely. And then when we survey afterwards, sometimes, definitely for festival, sometimes for other events, we'll do demographic surveys as part of the audience survey. But we also have some other survey mechanisms at the organization. So we try to balance like the request of the individual, not surveying the same people all the time and those kinds of things. And I would say an area that we haven't done a great job on, and I'm hoping is evolving, is really their topical interest. Like I can, in Eventbrite, I can segment like everybody who attended a healthcare event that we did in Dallas, right? And if I know that I'm coming back to do another healthcare event, I'm gonna go and message them. But if you can set up that rubric to kind of capture people and segment them by interest at the beginning, that would be super helpful for your organization, especially if you're doing events that cross different kinds of topics. So we're working hard on it, but it's an evolution in the technology to gather that and correctly tag people, either because they've given us information via their newsletter signups, this is the things that I'm interested in, or because they came to an event, all those different ways that we can kind of glean some information from people. We do use Salesforce, so all of our Eventbrite goes into Salesforce, and that's where I think our Salesforce wasn't really set up well to capture the interest information, right? So you could still go back and say, okay, everybody who attended that healthcare event in Dallas, but it relies on, like Agnes, who actually executed the event, to remember that we did it, to pull it, as opposed to like everybody got tagged and now they will show up in any search for Dallas healthcare interest, as an example. Oh, sure. Yeah, we can get more into tactics. So I know that some of you actually want to do events like this, and I will say that I think that everything that we're talking about here applies to this. It's just bigger, right? More staff, more money, more time, staff time. I don't think that there's anything that we're doing on festival that is not gleaned from what we've learned doing one-off events the rest of the year. And for those of you who maybe don't have professional event producers on staff, we actually outsource this. We hire a production company to help us produce this. We need our staff to focus on core competency, right? Whether it's selling sponsorship or audience engagement or editorial, what's happening on stage. We don't need, people, I think about, what color napkins are going where, but we don't need to take up a lot of staff time with those kinds of decisions for an event that this is this huge and requires, a million decisions on that level. So I'll just give you a little overview of the actual event. We utilized, I believe it was 10 venues this year. This is the there's like badged content that's taking place inside theaters and churches. We do wind up paying venue rental for this. We had been on the UT campus for the first 7 years of the event, and they were donating it in kind, but as the event grew, it became more burdensome to them, and they said to us at the end there that they were spending as much resources, time, and money on our event as they were spending on their own convocation. They were like, this is not really something that is sustainable. So we took the opportunity to bring the conversation downtown. The being on campus is limiting in lots of ways, and so let's just really go all out, bring the event downtown, and we added a whole free component, which is a Saturday street closure with tents of programming that we call Open Congress. So it's part of and as Evan mentioned, free was something that was really important to me to incorporate incorporate in the event, because we've been charging, between $150 to $300 for a pass to come to the festival when everything else that we were doing was free. So how can we get people in the door who maybe are not motivated to spend $200 yet on something that they don't really know about? So this is only in our second year this year, and we went from, I think it was like 4,700 registrants in 2017, which was our last year on campus, to about 8,600 registrants this year, where we've moved downtown. So we do see the possibility to really scale the event now that we have more options for space and free versus paid. And we're really kind of doubling down on the idea that people actually do want to come together and talk about these issues that are important to them. This is the free program, and we had sponsorship for these tents. I mentioned that some media partners were paid for festival. Politico came on as a paid sponsor, as did Texas Monthly. So that was giving them, the branded tent, and Evan actually worked with them to get their reporters involved in moderating the conversations, and some influence in the choice of topics and speakers that they were talking about. So that wound up being really collaborative programming with those sponsors. And then along the side, where you see those numbers, was where we had all these corporate sponsor activations as part of the festival in the fest. So they were doing fun things, HEB brought HEB Buddy, which is a kind of fun grocery bag character that they have. My son was super into it, just trying to get it to the point where it feels like it's a Texas celebration, in addition to the political and public policy conversations that were going on. So this is just kind of the event in a nutshell, and like I said, I don't think that there's anything that we're doing here that we're not doing as part of our 1 hour traveling event. We're just doing it, times 10. Instead of 4 speakers, we have 450. So it's a scale challenge. It's not a, as far as event production goes, like once you have the resources and the know-how to do that, then you're just talking about scale. And for those of you who want to do this, the first Texas Tribune Festival in 2011, it was a collaborative partnership. South by Southwest was the event production partner. Evan is friends with the guys who run that show, so he roped them into producing his show. We got UT to be our in-kind venue partner. So that's where I'm saying, this is exactly what we were doing with all the other events. And we had, I believe it was around 1,200 people that first year. And we've been in touch with others who've used our festival as a model. There's one in Seattle called Crosscut. There's another one in Wisconsin. What did they call it? Cap City, something like that. They also, in their first year events, were able to do kind of similar business, around 1,000 people for a day or two long event. So, if you hire out a production company to help you with all the logistics, and you focus on what you guys are good at, which is hopefully the fundraising piece and the audience and the program, it's accomplishable. It's not Mount Everest, I promise. So the secret sauce ingredients: keep your production costs low. Secure those partners and in-kind donations when possible, and leverage all of those relationships that you can. I threw this one in here. I mean, when you're experimenting, it's fine to say who's ever produced an event and, utilize their know-how to do it. But if they're a reporter and you're trying to get them to be the producer, they're not going to be both, right? So make sure that there's at least enough internal resources to do a minimal amount, and then if it's something that you really need to do on a regular basis, hire it out, because I know, like, I can't be manning the registration table, you know, dealing with that media partner who needs to get an interview, and also trying to usher a donor into a meet and greet, right? I'm only one person at the event, so events just require helping hands, and, you know, sometimes people in the newsroom, that's not their core competency. They might be willing to help you experiment and find some formats, but if it's something that you want to do on a regular basis, like, figure out how to staff it and pay for it. Don't just rely on somebody who's got some goodwill towards the project to do it. It'll just wind up creating resentment and probably an event that you won't be very happy with. And then April is always telling us to underpromise and overdeliver. So, you know, she's on the front lines of those conversations, and I do everything that I can to make sure that the people who are coming to our events are having a great experience. So on that audience survey, they're saying, wow, I loved Evan Smith, he's amazing, not the sound was horrible, or I couldn't find the parking, or the coffee was cold, like whatever those things are that just sour the experience, right? And you know this from anything that you've ever been to. So use those experiences that you've had with thinking through, like, how do I make sure people know where to park, you know? Make sure that the catering arrives on time, that you're there early to call them if they're not there. You know, those kinds of details that I think are just, you know, like I said, not rocket science, but somebody who has a planning and detail-oriented brain to make sure that you're delivering on. Okay, so I went over my time, right? I will go ahead and close out, but I will be here at lunch to talk more about events. Thank you.